Welcome to Bible Study. This is the Bible study we are preparing for June 9th, 2024 at St. Michael's Lutheran Church in Portland, Oregon. You'll see me standing right here next to this image of a boat. It hangs on the paraments of our church. The reason for that, because today we're going to have Paul sailing to Rome. But I want to just explore just for a moment that image of the sea because it shows up frequently, especially in the New Testament. The people of Israel lived in a part of the world that did not have a natural harbor. The Mediterranean Sea, if you know anything about the geography of that place, is quite smooth, or the coastline is very smooth. If you go north into what is Phoenicia, Syria, Lebanon today, you have Tyre and Sidon, excellent ports. And of course, to the south and a little bit to the west, you had the Nile Delta, where the Egyptians had ports. But in this little spot in between where Israel was, there was no way to really access the Mediterranean. The Romans had built a port by taking large stones and constructing sort of a jetty that allowed them to land boats at Caesarea. But the Israelites were historically never sailing people, which makes it very interesting that in the New Testament, water and particularly sailing imagery shows up so often. It was such that the Old Testament people rather saw the sea as kind of a sign of evil. It was chaos. It was the unbounded, chaotic, primordial world. And it was one of the places of evil. In the New Testament, that shifts quite a bit. If you'll notice, Jesus finds his first disciples. They're fishermen who make a living on the sea. Jesus himself has a number of instances where he is on that ocean, but yet that Old Testament motif shows up, doesn't it? Because he's calming those wild, unruly waves. But then we get another image of God's people that persists even afterwards, and that is of God's people as being sailors on a ship at sea. If you look at most churches that were built in Northern Europe and that kind of came to North America too, in the days before modern building materials, the ability to span a wide space was limited. And so oftentimes churches were long and narrow with a pointy roof, and it really looked like we were in an upside down boat. In fact, the word for this room in which I'm standing right now is called a nave. And that's related to the English word you know is navy. It's from the Latin word simply for boat. We're all in the boat. And so you see this little image right here of a boat whose mast has a cross atop it to power us along. And of course, that wind that blows us is nothing else than the Holy Spirit. Paul today is going to get into a boat, and they're going to sail, and it's not going to go well. At this point, the book of Acts reads a little like an adventure story. You're going to have a wild shipwreck. You're going to have encounters with wild beasts. It's quite the story. Let's dig into that. Paul, if you remember, had been before the governor Festus and King Agrippa and Agrippa's wife Bernice. And he had made his defense. He had described his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And he had said at the end, I really hope everybody can be like me. I want everybody to be a Christian. And at the end of that, Luke had described King Agrippa as somebody who knew and understood the Jewish situation there, all of the conflicting forces and opinions that made up the Jewish religion, and that at the end of it, Agrippa said, this man could have been set free. He should have been set free. Luke wants the reader, Theophilus, to know that the trial that Paul is about to face is really has no legitimacy. That it is something of a travesty of justice. In fact, the whole occasion for this last offense that Paul makes is because the governor, who is sending him off to Rome to be tried by the emperor, can't even formulate a charge. He's unable even to come up with, what is this guy, what am I sending him there for? Why is he going? What is the trial about? He doesn't even know what to say. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon. That's one of those ports up in Lebanon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. So they cut into the big island of Cyprus, where Paul, remember, started his missionary work. And they're on the side that's in the wind shade right there, in the lee of that. When they had sailed across to the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria, Egypt, sailing for Italy, and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone, coasting along it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. You can follow this along on a map, and I encourage you to find one. You can see exactly where he's going. They go under Cyprus, they go up to the coast of Asia Minor. They're barely making any headway because the winds are pushing against them, and they only have sail power at the time and oar power. And so they're either rowing or the wind is pushing them. And they go under the island of Crete, trying to avoid the contrary winds. Since a lot of time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of cargo and the ship, but also of lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So they knew they weren't going to make it all the way to Italy, but they knew that the place where they were wasn't quite suitable for them to spend the winter, because the storms were going to come in and batter that side of the coast. So they were going to try and make it into this other harbor on the very western tip of this long, narrow island of Crete. They don't make it. The south wind blew gently. Supposing they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And the wind and the ship was caught and could not face the wind. We gave way to it, and we were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship, and then, fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So what they've done now is they've lightened the boat, they've thrown everything overboard, and now they've even thrown over the sails and the ropes, everything they can do to lighten that ship. They are totally at the mercy of the storm, the wind, and the currents. They have no way now, other than the oars, if they've retained any of them, to steer or move this boat. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved at last abandoned. They've said, we're lost. We're going to die. Now, since they had been without food for a while, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you, take heart." And Paul is going to say, "An angel has appeared to me. God has given me a message. We're not going to die, but you need to eat something now." And so you see actually Paul more or less take over as captain of this ship. "We're going to run aground on some island," he says. When the 14th night had come, so 2 weeks they're out at sea. And you can imagine being out at sea in a very small wooden boat without much, with no navigational abilities. There's no radios. There's no way. You are just at the mercy of the elements here. For 2 weeks they're out at sea. About midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. And they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again. They found 15 fathoms, so that's getting shallower. Fearing we might run upon the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, they had lowered the boat. The sailors were going to try and get away and just abandon everybody. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless those men stay on the boat, we're all going to die." So the soldiers cut the boat, and they were all in the ship together. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day, and you haven't had anything to eat. Eat something. It'll give you strength. Not a hair of your head will perish from any of you." And when he had said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it, and he began to eat. And they were all encouraged. And some ate food themselves. We were all 276 people. These ancient boats were not very big. And this must have been absolutely crammed to the gills with people. 276 persons on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they lightened it, and they threw their wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, and they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchor and left them in the sea, and loosened the ropes, and they tied the rudders. And then they hoisted the foresail. They must have saved some tackle to the wind, and they made for the beach, but they struck a reef, and they ran the vessel aground, and the bow stuck, and it remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out that plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to make for the land, and the rest of them to grab a piece of wood, a plank from the ship. And so it was that everyone was saved. Paul's little prophecy had come true. This is such an interesting little story, and you have to ask, and we're going to stop right here, is why does Paul tell us this story of this shipwreck? I mean, it happened, would be one way to do it, but what does this suggest to a reader of the Bible? And what does it suggest to Theophilus and to somebody who is reading it then and somebody who is reading it today? Well, I mean, obviously we've noted before that in this account of Paul coming to his trial, he looks a little like Jesus. We talked about how he was resolutely facing this, even when he knew what was going to happen to him. He went to Jerusalem anyway. Well, here again, just as we noted before, we see Paul looking a little like Jesus. Here he is not necessarily calming the wind and the waves, but he is certainly calming the hearts and the minds of the people who are in the boat with him. And he ends up, by his actions, by his listening to God, and by being this person who gives them good advice, he ends up saving the lives of everyone in the boat. And he really ends up sort of being the guy in charge, even though, yes, there's still a centurion, and there's still a captain, and there are still the sailors, and all of those people. Luke depicts Paul as really being the man of the hour, the guy who is in charge. For somebody who is being sent to face a capital charge in Rome, somebody who is being really threatened with death, Paul is really fearless, and he is calm, and he is somebody who is, and I think this is really what Luke wants you to see. He's somebody who is a benefit to the world in which we live. And this has been a recurrent theme I now want to highlight inside the book of Acts. Paul is this exemplar of one of Luke's main pieces, is that this Christianity is really good for people. This Christianity is not a threat to the governing powers of the Roman authority. It's not a subversive or destructive or somehow we're going to turn the world upside down and destroy everything and make sure we get every, and just wreck the world, as we see so many try and do today. But rather, Christianity is constructive. It is helpful. It is preserving human life rather than taking human life. That's contrasted with the Jewish fanatics of Paul's day. In the ancient world, the Jewish people would foment a number of rebellions in Palestine, and at great loss of life would ultimately be crushed by the Roman Empire. But even others that are circulating around, other cults and other religions that are percolating through the Roman system at the time, oftentimes are very self-centered, and they are very not very considerate of the needs and the lives of the people who are around them. Notice this Christianity which Luke describes here is in fact very constructive. It is a contributing part of this society. Paul ends up saving this entire ship full of people. And had they listened to him, he might have saved the cargo, the ship, and everything else. But as it was, even though they didn't listen to him, he didn't give up on them, but instead he ended up helping them. How is Christianity today still part of that constructive world? How is it still helping people thrive and survive in the difficulties of this world today? I think that's a really interesting question, and I'd encourage you to ask it, and let's talk more about that on Sunday. God bless you.